It was a hot summer afternoon, one of those days when the air seemed to vibrate with heat. 5th Avenue buzzed with people, cars, and noise. João leaned against one of the lampposts, watching the frantic rush of the city. For him, the days no longer felt different. After so many years on the streets, time seemed to move slowly, almost stopping. That street corner had been what he called home for a long time. His calloused hands held an old sign that read, "I need help for food." But people rarely glanced at him. Most of the time, João was invisible to the world. He had grown used to being just another shadow in the urban landscape, another piece in the city's puzzle. But on that day, something broke the routine. From a distance, he noticed a small girl, with curly hair and a pink dress, running along the sidewalk. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old. She was laughing as she played with a balloon, under the watchful eyes of her parents, who walked behind her, chatting absent-mindedly. João smiled at the purity of the child, something so rare and beautiful in such an impersonal place as Paulista. Then everything happened very quickly. The balloon slipped from the girl's hands and floated up, over the street. Without thinking twice, she ran after it, heading toward the busy road. João jumped up, his heart racing. He knew the child had no idea of the danger she was in. Within seconds, he ran toward the girl, his body moving more by instinct than reason. As little Jane reached the middle of the street, a car approached at high speed. The driver didn't seem to notice the girl. In a split second, João threw himself in front of the car, pulling Jane out of the road. The impact was inevitable. The car managed to brake, but not before grazing João, throwing him hard to the ground. The frightened girl began to cry in João's arms, but she was safe. His body ached, but the relief of having saved the child outweighed any physical pain. Jane's parents ran frantically toward their daughter, pulling her from João's arms without even realizing who the man was that had just saved her life. The mother hugged her tightly while the father, still pale from the shock, hurriedly thanked João, not fully understanding what had happened. "My God, you saved our daughter. How can we thank you?" the father said, his voice trembling. João, still on the ground, smiled wearily. He didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to being noticed, let alone receiving thanks. He was dizzy from the blow, but his eyes fixed on Jane's, who looked at him with a mix of fear and curiosity. I just did what anyone would do," João mumbled, trying to stand up, but his legs gave way. At that moment, Jane's mother, visibly shaken, also approached. She held João's hand for a moment, with a look of genuine gratitude. "We will take care of you," she said, decisively. "What you did for our daughter, it's priceless. We will help you. We promise." The words hung in the air like a sincere promise. João expected nothing in return, but at that moment, a spark of hope lit up inside him. Perhaps, for the first time in years, he believed that things might get better. Maybe, that day marked the end of his life on the streets. Soon, an ambulance was called, and João was taken to the hospital to treat his injuries. They were minor, but the emotional impact was greater. On the way there, he found himself thinking about that rich and elegant family who had promised to change his life. Could it be possible? After so many years of abandonment and contempt, could his luck finally be turning? At the hospital, João received the bare minimum of care. No family or friends accompanied him, as expected. But shortly after, Jane's parents arrived, visibly relieved to see he was all right. "We'll make sure you have a place to stay and food to eat," Jane's father said solemnly. "You saved the most precious thing in our lives, and for that, we will be eternally grateful." João, who had long since learned not to be fooled by promises, remained skeptical. But still, hope blossomed in his chest. They seemed sincere, and maybe, just maybe, his life was about to change. The family left, promising to return the next day. João spent the night in the hospital, imagining what it would be like to have a home again, a place to sleep without fear, food on the table. He even thought about how he might regain a dignified life, perhaps even find a job. However, the following days were filled with silence. The family didn't return as promised. At first, João tried to justify the delay. Maybe they were busy. Maybe there was a misunderstanding. But as the weeks passed, he realized the promise had been forgotten, just as he had been so many times before. João returned to the streets, with the same sign in his hands and a slightly heavier heart. The warmth of gratitude he had felt on the day of the accident was replaced by the coldness of disappointment. He couldn't understand how something so important to him, a promise that represented the chance for a new life, could be forgotten so easily by those people. But life had to go on. In the solitude of his nights, João still found himself thinking about Jane. Maybe one day she would grow up and remember him, the man who saved her. And perhaps, one day, the promise would be fulfilled. The first few days after the accident were filled with relief and joy for Jane's family. The scare had been immense, but the tragedy was avoided. As Jane's parents resumed their lives, caught up in commitments, travels, and social events, the name of João, the man who had saved their daughter, began to fade from their conversations. In the first week, Jane's father, Augusto, mentioned João during some meetings with close friends, always starting with, "You won't believe what happened," and ending the story with a tone of heroism, as if the event had already become something distant, almost a legend. Jane's mother, Helena, still grew emotional when she recalled her daughter's frightened face in João's arms, but the intensity of that moment gradually faded as the daily routine returned. There were parties to organize, important meetings to attend, and the new renovation of the family's house occupied her mind. "We really need to get in touch with that man," Helena commented one night while getting ready for bed. "He saved us. I promised we'd take care of him." "Yes, of course," Augusto replied distractedly, his eyes fixed on his phone. "I'll see what I can do tomorrow." But tomorrow never came. Days turned into weeks, and João's name, once synonymous with heroism and gratitude, was slowly swallowed by the family's endless commitments. For Augusto and Helena, what had once seemed like a moral obligation became a distant inconvenience. After all, they had already helped João at the hospital, and he seemed to be doing fine the last time they saw him. As for Jane, she was too young to understand the depth of the promise made to João. She continued with her life as usual, going to school, playing with her friends, while her parents showered her with love and attention. The memories of the accident, for her, began to fade like a distant dream. But João did not forget. After leaving the hospital, he returned to the streets, to the same spot on Avenida Paulista where he had spent so many years. Sitting beside the same sign he had been holding for so long, he felt something inside him had changed. It wasn't just his body, which still ached after the car's impact, but his heart. The brief hope he had felt, that spark of light that had ignited in the hospital, now seemed to have been completely extinguished. Days dragged by, like an endless march of disappointment. Every time João looked at the people rushing by, he wondered if they would ever see him as more than just a beggar. Did they know that he had saved a life? That, for a brief moment, he had been a hero? Over time, João began to grasp the bitter reality. He was no longer remembered. The act that, for him, had represented a chance to change his life had become nothing more than a background story for Jane's parents. The promise made with such fervor and emotion now seemed to hold no value. At times, João tried to justify it in his mind. Maybe the family had forgotten because they were busy. Maybe they just needed more time. He even thought about trying to find them, but how could he? He didn't even know where they lived. Besides, the shame of having been forgotten prevented him from taking any action. On rainy days, when the cold sidewalk was his only refuge, João reflected on fate. Maybe the mistake had been his. Perhaps he had expected too much from people who lived in a world so different from his own. He had nothing to offer, just his action, and apparently, that wasn't enough to change his fortune. Time slowly eroded João's optimism. Every unfulfilled promise, every glance averted by people passing by, fed his growing skepticism and pain. The few friends he had on the streets had heard his story countless times, and while some listened sympathetically, others looked at him with disdain. "Did you really think they were going to help you?" said Carlos, an older man who had been living on the streets for over 20 years. "These people don't care. To them, we're invisible. They only remember us when they need a pretty story to tell at dinner parties." João knew Carlos was right, but still, he couldn't shake the sting of disillusionment that followed him every day. Jane, the little girl with curly hair, often appeared in his thoughts. He wondered how she was doing. Did she remember him? Would she ever realize that her parents had not kept their promise? As the years went by, Jane grew up. She became a curious and intelligent teenager with a strong desire to make a difference in the world. Sometimes, when she asked her parents about the man who had saved her, she received vague answers, as if he were just a distant and unnecessary memory. "He was very brave, Jane," Helena would say. "But life goes on, and we couldn't do much more for him." Over time, Jane began to question that justification. How could her parents, who always preached the importance of gratitude and generosity, have allowed a man like João to be forgotten? But she was still too young to fully understand the complexities of the adult world. Yet, deep in her heart, something told her that one day, somehow, she would find a way to make it right. Meanwhile, João continued his life on the streets, fighting to survive. Winter came with its cold breeze, and as always, he did what he could to stay warm and find a little food. His once strong body was now beginning to feel the effects of age and years of neglect. He didn't know how much longer he could hold on. The promise made on that hot afternoon seemed as distant as the days when João still had a home, a family, and dreams. What remained was the harsh reality of the streets, where promises get lost in the wind, and hopes disappear in the dark corners of the city. Years passed like a gentle breeze, carrying away the memories of the accident that had nearly taken Jane's life. For her, the recollections of that day were hazy, like images flickering in her mind from time to time, as if from a forgotten dream upon waking. Yet, the figure of the man who had saved her still appeared occasionally in her thoughts, especially when she lay down to sleep, and the silence of the night led her to reflect on her life. Jane grew up in a comfortable home, surrounded by luxury and opportunities that most people could only dream of having. Her parents, Augusto and Helena, ensured that she received the best education, the best teachers, and the finest gifts. Despite this, Jane was different. From a young age, she displayed an immense curiosity about the world around her. She loved asking questions, especially the kind that adults usually avoided answering. By the time she was 10 years old, Jane was already an avid reader. She loved adventure and mystery books, but as she grew older, she began to show interest in deeper subjects, such as stories of overcoming adversity and books that discussed social inequality. Her parents, always busy with work and social events, were impressed by the maturity their daughter showed. "She's so young, but she already thinks about things we don't even have time to discuss," Helena remarked one day, noticing Jane reading a book about human rights. "That's true," Augusto said with a proud smile. "Our daughter's going to go far. But maybe she's worrying too much about things that don't concern her." Helena nodded, but something about Jane's concern for the less fortunate sparked an unease in her mind. Jane asked uncomfortable questions, especially about that man, the forgotten hero who had saved her years before. "Mom, what happened to the man who saved me?" Jane asked one afternoon as she helped her mother set the table for dinner. Helena paused for a moment, hesitating before answering. Jane didn't ask that question often, but when she did, it always made Helena uncomfortable. She knew the promise made that day had been left behind, like so many other things that get lost in the routine of life. "Oh, darling, he was fine the last time we saw him," Helena replied, trying to sound casual. "We did what we could for him." Jane furrowed her brow, sensing that the answer was too vague for her liking. "But is he still on the streets? Did you help him find a home?" Helena sighed. She knew she couldn't lie, but she also didn't want to prolong the conversation. In truth, she no longer knew what had happened to João. After the hospital visit, the family had moved on with their lives and had never contacted him again. I'm not sure, Jane. After that day, he went his way, and we went ours. That's how life is, Helena said, avoiding her daughter's gaze. Jane fell silent, but the question kept circling in her mind. How could someone who had been so important in her life be simply forgotten? She understood that people followed different paths, but something about that story deeply troubled her. It didn't seem right. By the time she turned 15, Jane was already a socially conscious and inquisitive teenager. She became involved in volunteer groups at school, always helping with donation drives for the homeless and social projects aimed at including marginalized people. These activities made her feel useful, but they also stirred feelings of guilt. She lived in a bubble of comfort, while so many people around her struggled to survive. How could her parents, and others of their social class, simply ignore these harsh realities? During one of these donation drives, Jane and some friends organized a visit to a homeless shelter. It was her first time participating in something so directly connected to the issue, and the anticipation of hearing these people's stories made her anxious. As she walked through the corridors of the shelter, Jane observed the people sitting on the wooden benches, some with their heads down, others chatting among themselves. Each of them carried a story of struggle and loss, and Jane felt the weight of their pain almost physically. She approached an elderly woman sitting alone and struck up a conversation. The woman told her how she had lost her home after her husband's death, and how, without any income, she had been evicted. Stories like this were common in that environment, but each one felt like a new wound opening in Jane's soul. She couldn't help but wonder how society could be so cruel as to leave people adrift like that. Just as she was about to leave the shelter, something happened. A man with white hair and a face weathered by time was sitting in a dark corner. His eyes seemed distant, but something about his posture caught Jane's attention. She couldn't explain it, but she felt a strange familiarity when she looked at him. With hesitant steps, Jane approached. He didn't seem to notice her presence until she stopped right in front of him. "Hi," she said softly, almost afraid to interrupt his thoughts. The man slowly raised his eyes, and for a brief moment, Jane felt a shiver run through her body. Those eyes, she knew them. Something inside her screamed that she had crossed paths with this man before. "You," he whispered, his voice raspy and weakened by time. "You're the girl." Jane frowned, confused. How could he know who she was? "What did you say?" she asked, her heart starting to race. "Jane." The man continued, too weak to stand up. I saved you." And then it all came rushing back. Like a wave of memories, Jane remembered the story her parents had told when she was a little girl. The story of the man who had saved her life in an accident. The man who had been forgotten. He was sitting right in front of her. Older, weaker, but still alive. She knelt down in front of him, unsure of what to say. The image of this man on the streets, after everything he had done for her, felt like a stab to her heart. I remember you," she said, her voice trembling. "You're João, aren't you? The man who saved me." João nodded slowly, his eyes glistening with tears. He had never imagined that the girl he had saved so many years ago would find him again. But here she was, a young and strong woman, so different from the frightened little girl he had once held in his arms. "Yes," he replied, his voice barely audible. "It's me. But I never wanted anything. I just wanted to make sure you were okay." Jane felt a wave of emotion wash over her. His words were filled with humility and resignation, as if he no longer expected anything from life. How could her parents have left him like this? How could such an important promise have been forgotten? She knew she couldn't let it stay this way. The promise had to be fulfilled. And this time, she would personally make sure it happened. The sky over Sao Paulo was starting to darken, painting the city in shades of orange and pink. Jane walked through the streets with her heart racing, still processing what had just happened. The reunion with João had deeply affected her. Her steps, once determined, were now hesitant, as if the weight of a responsibility greater than she could bear was pressing down on her shoulders. She felt overwhelmed. The image of João, so old and frail, lingered in her mind. He was no longer just a childhood memory, he was the man who had saved her life. And now, he was in a situation that made her question everything she believed about her family and the world around her. Jane stopped in front of a cafe window, watching the people inside. They were all so caught up in their own lives, so oblivious to what was happening around them. She couldn't help but wonder, how many stories like João's were hidden in the shadows of the city? How many people, like him, had been forgotten? She felt the need to act, but doubt gnawed at her mind. How could she make a difference now, after so much time had passed? Her parents had always been her moral compass, and the fact that they had abandoned João left her confused and angry. She knew she had to confront them, but she was also afraid of what she might discover about her own family. When she arrived home, Jane entered slowly, her thoughts in turmoil. The luxurious and well-decorated surroundings clashed violently with the images she carried in her mind. Her parents were in the living room, as usual, engrossed in their routines. Helena was reading a fashion magazine, while Augusto flipped through some work papers. It was as if nothing had changed. Jane stood still for a moment, watching them, trying to understand how they could be so oblivious to everything. She took a deep breath and decided she could no longer put off the conversation. "We need to talk," she said, breaking the silence in the room. Helena and Augusto both looked up at the same time, surprised by Jane's firm tone. "Of course, darling. What is it?" Helena asked, still flipping through the magazine. "It's about João," Jane replied, feeling the tension rise as she spoke his name. Helena stopped flipping the magazine, and Augusto lowered his papers, both now fully focused on their daughter. "João," Augusto repeated, as if trying to remember where he knew that name from. "The man who saved my life," Jane said, her voice thick with emotion. "I found him today." Silence fell like a heavy cloud over the room. Helena's face turned pale, and Augusto shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Jane knew she had touched a wound her parents preferred to ignore. "Jane," Helena began, carefully choosing her words. "That was so many years ago. We did what we could back then. You abandoned him." Jane interrupted, unable to contain the anger in her voice. "You promised to help him, but you never kept that promise. He's on the streets, sick and alone. And I can't understand how you let this happen." Helena and Augusto exchanged tense glances. It was clear that this subject had been buried for so long that even they didn't know how to handle it anymore. "It wasn't that simple," Augusto began, trying to sound calm but visibly uncomfortable. "We helped him as much as we could. We gave him some money, we helped at the hospital. But Jane, you don't understand how the world really works. We can't carry the burden of every person who crosses our path." Jane felt the anger inside her grow. That hollow justification only made her heart ache more. "He saved my life," she exclaimed, standing up from her chair. "If it weren't for him, I wouldn't be here. You owed him much more than a hospital visit and some money. You owed him a second chance. You promised." Helena, who had been silent until then, finally spoke, her voice trembling. "Jane, we intended to help, but life got in the way. The commitments, the responsibilities. Things got out of hand, and," she hesitated, visibly emotional. "We failed. We know that." Jane studied her mother, seeing the fragility in her words. She had never seen Helena like this, so vulnerable. But it didn't ease the weight of what she was feeling. "I'm going to help João," Jane said firmly. "You may have failed, but I won't make the same mistake. He saved me, and now it's my turn to save him." Silence filled the room once again. Helena seemed to want to say something but remained quiet, while Augusto sighed heavily. They knew Jane was determined, and nothing they said would change her mind. In the days that followed, Jane immersed herself in her mission to help João. She went back to the shelter where she had found him and spoke with the administrators, explaining that she wanted to help that man specifically. She did everything she could to ensure that João received medical care, taking him to appointments and buying the necessary medications. At first, João was reluctant. He had grown used to being ignored, forgotten by the unfulfilled promises. Even though Jane was now there, willing to help him, he felt that it might be too late to change the course of his life. "I don't need charity," he said, his voice hoarse, when Jane took him to a doctor's appointment. "I've been living like this for so long. I don't know if I can go back to living any other way." Jane, feeling the weight of his words, gently took João's hands. She knew his life had been marked by disappointment, but she also knew that even if he didn't believe it, he deserved a second chance. "It's not charity, João," she replied, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm here because you saved my life. And I can't keep living knowing that yours was left behind. It's not too late. We can still change this." João looked at her, his eyes filled with exhaustion, but something in Jane's tone made him feel a small glimmer of hope for the first time in years. That determined look reminded him of the little girl he had saved, all those years ago. Maybe, just maybe, there was still time for something different. As the days went by, Jane continued to take care of João. Besides the medical care, she found him a small room in a better shelter, away from the streets. João, although grateful, still carried a sense of bitterness for the years he had lost. He wasn't used to receiving help, much less trusting that people would actually keep their promises. But Jane was determined. Each visit, each gesture of care, was a way to honor the promise her parents had broken. And more than that, it was a way to redeem herself, to show that even though the world had failed João, she would not. As João began to regain some of his health, Jane realized that, despite all the suffering, something good was emerging from the experience. She was changing, becoming someone stronger, more aware of the realities of the world. And most importantly, she was building a new connection with João, something that went beyond the debt she felt toward him. She knew there was still much work ahead. João, despite everything, was still a man wounded both physically and emotionally. But now, he was no longer alone. The days following her reunion with João were a whirlwind for Jane. Every moment, her mind drifted back to the image of him, sitting in the shelter, aged and sick, as if forgotten by everyone, even himself. It weighed heavily on her. The unfulfilled promise her parents had made loomed over her conscience like a shadow she couldn't shake off. Jane knew she had to do something, but she also realized that to move forward, she would have to confront her parents and ask why they had abandoned the man who had done so much for them. It wouldn't be an easy conversation, but Jane couldn't ignore the truth any longer. One cold, rainy night, she returned home. The sound of raindrops falling outside echoed the heaviness in her chest. Her parents were in the living room, as always, engrossed in their routines. Augusto was reading the newspaper, and Helena was watching a television show. The cozy, comfortable atmosphere of their home contrasted violently with the scenes Jane had witnessed at the shelter days earlier. Jane took a deep breath and entered the living room. This time, she was determined to speak. "We need to talk," she said, interrupting the silence that had settled over the room. Helena and Augusto looked up, surprised by the serious tone in their daughter's voice. It wasn't like Jane to speak so firmly. She had always been polite and gentle, avoiding direct confrontations. "Of course, dear. What's wrong?" Helena asked, adjusting herself on the couch. "I found João," Jane said bluntly. Her parents' expressions immediately changed. Augusto set the newspaper aside, visibly uncomfortable, while Helena turned pale, as if she had been struck by an invisible blow. João. Augusto repeated, as if trying to process the name. The man who saved your life. Yes, Jane replied. The man you promised to help and then abandoned. The silence that followed was almost tangible. Helena and Augusto exchanged nervous glances, clearly unsettled by Jane's direct accusation. The truth, however uncomfortable, was now out in the open, and there was no way to avoid it. Jane, darling, Helena began, trying to find the right words. We didn't abandon him. We did what we could at the time. We took him to the hospital, helped him where we could. Helped him? Jane interrupted, her voice thick with indignation. You left him to go back to the streets. He's still out there, alone, sick, living in misery. How can you justify that? Augusto stood up from the couch, visibly irritated by his daughter's tone. It's not that simple, Jane. The world isn't black and white. At that time, we did what we could. But we can't carry the weight of every person who crosses our path. We have responsibilities, we have a life of our own. And João, as sad as it may be, is part of a reality we can't fix on our own. Jane stared at her father, incredulous. She had always seen him as a fair and honorable man, but now, as he tried to justify their actions, she saw something in him she hadn't noticed before, a coldness, a willingness to rationalize neglect as though it were a normal, acceptable thing. Responsibilities? Jane repeated, disbelief in her voice. You had the responsibility to save the life of the man who saved mine. It's not about carrying the weight of the world. It's about keeping a promise. A promise that meant the chance at a new life for him. You failed him. And I won't. Helena, who had been silent until then, finally spoke, her voice low and trembling. Jane, you're being unfair. We wanted to help. But things got complicated. Life happened, and we put it aside. It wasn't a conscious decision, it was, she hesitated, searching for the right words. It was a mistake. But what do you want us to do now? Jane remained quiet for a moment, processing her mother's words. She knew blaming her parents for what they hadn't done wouldn't fix anything. The only thing she could do now was act. I'm going to fix what you left behind, Jane said firmly. João is still alive, and I'm going to help him. No matter how much time has passed, he deserves for that promise to be fulfilled. And if you're not going to do it, I will. Helena and Augusto exchanged another glance, this time filled with guilt and regret. Jane knew, deep down, they were aware they had been wrong. But she also knew she couldn't depend on them to make it right. It was her mission now, and she couldn't turn back. The next morning, Jane began to take action. She returned to the shelter where João was staying and started talking with the administrators. She explained the situation, telling them she wanted to help João get off the streets and live a dignified life. They were surprised by Jane's dedication but agreed to help. The first step was ensuring João received proper medical treatment. Jane took him to several appointments, making sure he was getting the necessary care for his weakened health. João, though reluctant at first, slowly began to realize that Jane was serious. Gradually, he started to open up to the idea that maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for him. Why are you doing this? João asked one afternoon, while Jane accompanied him to yet another medical appointment. You don't owe me anything. I did what anyone would have done that day. Jane looked at him, offering a sad smile. I do owe you, João. You saved my life, and I need to repay you for that. I can't live knowing you were left behind while I went on with my life. You deserve a second chance, and I'm going to make sure you get it. João remained silent, Jane's words echoing in his mind. For years, he had convinced himself that he was unworthy of help, that his life on the streets was an inevitable consequence of all that he had lost. But Jane, with her youth and determination, was showing him something he had long forgotten, that there were still people who cared. As Jane continued caring for João, taking him to appointments and helping him find a decent place to live, her parents began to see the impact of the decision they had made years ago. Helena, in particular, felt more and more guilty for having abandoned João. The image of that man, aged and sick, lingered in her mind. One night, she sat beside Augusto, her expression filled with sadness. "We were wrong, Augusto," she said quietly. "We left that man behind, and now our daughter is trying to fix our mistake. We can't ignore this any longer." Augusto sighed, feeling the weight of his wife's words. He knew she was right. They had failed João, and now Jane was taking on the responsibility that should have been theirs. "Maybe it's time we did our part too," Augusto finally admitted, acknowledging his guilt. In the days that followed, Helena and Augusto began to get more involved in João's life, visiting him at the shelter and offering help. Though it was hard for them to face their regrets, they knew it was the least they could do to try to right the wrong of the past. As for Jane, she felt a mixture of relief and satisfaction seeing her parents finally recognize the impact of their actions. The journey was far from over, but now, she knew she wasn't alone. Together, they could give João the life he deserved, and at last, the promise they had made so long ago was beginning to be fulfilled. Time moved on, and Jane's involvement in João's life grew deeper with each passing day. She accompanied him to medical appointments, searched for housing options, and made sure he received all the care he needed. Every day, João seemed more present, more willing to believe that maybe, just maybe, he did deserve a second chance. However, despite all her efforts, Jane began to realize that helping João would not be as simple as she had imagined. It wasn't just about getting him off the streets and ensuring his physical health. The bigger battle was against the years of bitterness and disappointment João had accumulated. That invisible pain was far harder to heal. One morning, Jane visited João at the shelter, as usual. But upon arriving, she noticed something different in his behavior. He seemed more withdrawn, distant, as if something was deeply troubling him. Sitting in a corner of the courtyard, João barely looked up when Jane approached. "João, is everything okay?" Jane asked, concerned. João took a deep breath but remained silent for a few moments, staring at the ground. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, filled with resentment. "Why are you doing this, Jane?" he asked, still not looking up. "I don't need charity. I don't need someone to feel good about helping a poor wretch like me." Jane was caught off guard by the harshness in his words. She sat down beside him, trying to understand where these feelings were coming from. "It's not charity, João. I've told you that before. I want to help you because you deserve it. You saved my life, and that means a lot to me. I'm not doing this to feel good, I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do." João finally lifted his eyes, and Jane saw a deep pain in them, mixed with years of disillusionment. "You don't understand, Jane. The streets, they make you lose everything, even the will to live. For years, I was forgotten by everyone. So why now, suddenly, do you and your parents want to help me?" He shook his head, incredulous. "I don't trust people anymore. They only remember you when they need to feel better about themselves." Jane felt a lump in her throat. João's words struck her in an unexpected way. She hadn't realized how much his time on the streets had shaped his worldview. He had become so accustomed to being ignored that he couldn't believe someone genuinely wanted to help him now. "I understand that you're hurt, João," Jane said, trying to hold back her tears. "And I can't change what happened to you in the past. But I can change the present. I can be here for you now. And I'll keep being here, even if you don't believe that." João remained silent for a few minutes. He knew Jane was being sincere, but something inside him prevented him from fully trusting her. The years on the streets had hardened him, and his pride was still a difficult barrier to overcome. "I don't know if I can accept this," he admitted, his voice trembling. "For so long, I've been on my own. And now, all of a sudden, you show up and want to fix everything. But not everything can be fixed, Jane. Jane placed a hand on João's shoulder in a gesture of support. She knew he was fighting an internal battle, trying to adjust to a new reality. And deep down, she understood that it was hard for him to accept that someone genuinely wanted to help him. Not everything can be fixed, João, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. I believe you can have a new life if you let me and my parents help. We failed you before, but we won't fail again. João sighed deeply and slowly nodded. He knew there was truth in Jane's words, but the idea of depending on someone again still scared him. However, he couldn't deny that, for the first time in many years, he felt a spark of hope. In the days that followed, Jane intensified her efforts to ensure João had everything he needed. She managed to transfer him to a better shelter, with more resources and support. The small room he received, complete with a bed, bathroom, and a closet, was simple but represented a huge step forward in João's life. He hadn't had a space of his own in so long. However, despite these improvements, João continued to struggle with his own demons. The distrust and pride were still barriers Jane had to face constantly. At times, João would isolate himself, refusing help from Jane or the shelter staff, as if trying to prove to himself that he could still survive on his own. One afternoon, after a tense visit where João refused to talk, Jane returned home feeling exhausted. She sat on the couch in silence, while her parents watched her, noticing her weary expression. "Is everything okay, honey?" Helena asked, concerned. Jane shook her head, unable to hide her frustration. "I don't know if I'm helping João. He's still so closed off, so resentful. Sometimes it feels like he doesn't want to be helped. I don't know what to do." Augusto, who had been silent until then, walked over and placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "I understand your frustration, Jane. We failed João, and now we're trying to make up for it. But you have to understand, he's been through a lot of hard things. It won't be easy for him to trust again. Healing takes time." Helena, her eyes full of tenderness, agreed. "What you're doing is important, Jane. You're showing him that he still has value, that he hasn't been forgotten. That's more than any financial or material help. It's emotional. Keep trying. João might resist at first, but deep down, he knows you're there for him." Jane took a deep breath, feeling a little more at ease with her parents' words. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she couldn't give up. João had given her a second chance at life, and she was determined to do the same for him. A few weeks later, things began to change. João slowly started accepting more of Jane's help. He began to open up, telling stories of his life before he ended up on the streets, about the dreams he once had and the people he had lost along the way. Jane listened intently, without judgment, offering only empathy and understanding. It was through these conversations that João started to realize that, despite everything, there was still something worth saving. He was still capable of building a new life, even if it meant setting aside his pride and accepting that he needed help. The turning point came on a sunny afternoon when Jane visited the shelter and found João standing by the window. He turned to her, and for the first time since they reunited, he smiled sincerely. "I've been thinking, maybe it's time to really start over," he said softly. "You were right, Jane. There's still time to fix some things. And I want to try." Jane, surprised and emotional, smiled back. This was the moment she had been waiting for. João was finally willing to let go of his past filled with pain and bitterness and embrace a new possibility of life. The road ahead would still be long, but that smile was a sign that, at last, the change had begun. The sun was high in the sky when Jane arrived at the shelter that morning. There was something different in the air, a sense of optimism she hadn't felt since she started helping João. After months of resistance, he was finally ready to accept the help being offered. The change hadn't come all at once, but Jane knew that the afternoon when he smiled and told her he was ready to try again had been a turning point. As she entered the shelter, she found João sitting at a table, flipping through an old newspaper. He looked up and smiled as soon as he saw her. "Good morning," he said, giving her a small nod. "Good morning, João. Are you ready for today's appointment?" Jane asked cautiously, still wary of getting too hopeful about his progress. João nodded, folding the newspaper and standing up with some difficulty. His body still bore the weight of years spent living on the streets, but now, with proper medical care and better nutrition, his health was gradually improving. They walked together to the clinic, where João had another routine checkup. Along the way, Jane glanced at him out of the corner of her eye, noticing how his demeanor had changed. There was something new in his eyes, a subtle, yet steady, glimmer of hope she feared she might never see. "You know, I never thought I'd live to see a second chance," João said, breaking the silence as they walked. "After so long, you get used to thinking that things won't change. But, well, here you are, and somehow, things did change." Jane smiled at him, but she also felt the weight of responsibility. She knew that, despite her best efforts, she couldn't fix everything. João's journey was far from over, and he still faced many challenges. But for now, this small step forward was a victory. "Everyone deserves a second chance, João," she replied softly. "Sometimes all we need is someone to remind us of that." After the appointment, Jane walked João back to the shelter, but on the way, she made a suggestion. "I've been thinking, how would you feel about visiting our house this weekend?" she asked. "My parents would like to see you too." João hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea. Although he had started to accept Jane into his life, he still harbored a certain bitterness toward her parents. The abandonment years ago had left a wound that wouldn't heal easily. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," he murmured, looking down at the ground. Jane understood. She knew that complete reconciliation between João and her parents would be difficult, maybe even impossible, but she also felt it was important for him to have the opportunity to confront the past. It wasn't just about her parents making amends with him, it was about João making peace with what had happened. "Whenever you're ready, João," she said gently. "There's no rush. I just want you to know that the door is open." Days passed, and little by little, João began adjusting to his new life. Although he was still living in the shelter, he started getting involved in small activities, and with Jane's support, he began looking for ways to reintegrate into society. The confidence he had lost over the years on the streets was slowly returning, though it was fragile and cautious. But Jane knew there was still more to be done. João carried a heavy emotional burden, and she understood that, to truly move forward, he needed to confront the ghosts of his past, including her parents. One late afternoon, as Jane was helping João organize his room at the shelter, he made the decision she had been hoping for. "Maybe it's time I accept your invitation," João said with a sigh. "Maybe it's time I talk to your parents." Jane smiled, feeling a wave of relief and hope. She knew that moment would be difficult for everyone, but she also knew it was necessary. João couldn't heal all his wounds without facing what had happened. The following weekend, Jane brought João to her home. It was the first time he had set foot there since the day he had saved her life, so many years ago. Memories of the past flooded his mind as he walked through the well-tended garden, feeling like a stranger in a world that had never been his. Helena and Augusto were waiting in the living room. When João entered, the air grew tense. They stood up, visibly nervous. João watched them for a moment, assessing them. He knew he couldn't erase what had happened, but he also understood that this meeting wasn't about blame or revenge. It was about redemption, about moving forward. "João," Augusto began, his voice shaky. "We're glad you came. And before anything else, we want to apologize. We know we failed you, and nothing we do now can change that. But we want you to know that we are truly sorry for not keeping our promise." João looked at Augusto and then at Helena, who seemed equally uncomfortable, her eyes brimming with tears. He could sense the sincerity in their words, but he also knew that, as genuine as the apologies were, they wouldn't change the past. For a long time, I waited for this moment, João said, his voice low but steady. I didn't know if it would ever come, but, well, here we are. I've learned, from living on the streets, that waiting too long for people only leads to disappointment. But today, I see that maybe, in some way, you're also trying to do what's right. He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. I don't know if I can fully forgive you. What I went through was hard, very hard. But I also know that holding on to resentment will only keep me tied to the past. And I don't want to live in the past anymore. Helena began to cry softly, while Augusto nodded, visibly emotional. Jane, standing beside João, felt tears welling up in her own eyes. This conversation, as difficult as it was an important step for everyone. Thank you for being here, João, Helena said, her voice choked with emotion. We know what we did can't be easily forgiven, but we want to help change your present and future, in any way we can. João looked at them once more, feeling the tension in the room begin to dissolve. Let's see what the future holds, then, he said with a small smile. Starting over isn't easy, but maybe I'm ready to try. The meeting marked a turning point in João's journey, and for Jane's family as well. While the scars of the past couldn't be entirely erased, there was now an understanding, a mutual respect for what each of them had been through. João knew that the road to complete redemption would be long, but with Jane, and now her parents, by his side, he felt that he wouldn't have to walk that path alone. In the months that followed, João continued rebuilding his life. He became involved in shelter projects, helping others in similar situations and sharing his story as a way to inspire those who had also lost hope. Jane and her parents continued to support him, not just financially but emotionally, forging a bond of solidarity and friendship. And so, the long-forgotten promise began to be fulfilled, not just through actions but through the human connection it had created between them all. The morning air was crisp, and the São Paulo sky seemed bluer than usual. João strolled through the shelter's garden, taking deep breaths as he watched the leaves flutter in the breeze. He felt lighter, as if a burden he'd carried for so many years was finally being lifted. The path to this point hadn't been easy, but he knew he was starting a new chapter in life, one he never imagined he would have. Since reconnecting with Jane and her parents, something within João had shifted. The bitterness that once gnawed at his soul had been replaced by something more subtle, hope. And with that hope came the certainty that he could, indeed, start over. That very day, Jane arrived at the shelter with the same warm smile she always carried. She had been visiting him almost daily since they began this journey together, and each visit was a reminder that João was no longer alone. Ready for the big move? She asked, her voice full of enthusiasm. João smiled, a genuine smile that Jane rarely saw before. Today was the day he would leave the shelter and move into a small apartment that Jane had helped him secure. It was a modest space, but the fact that he had a place to call home, one with dignity and safety, was already a huge step. Ready, he replied, his voice tinged with emotion. I never thought I'd say this, but I'm ready. The weeks leading up to that day had been a period of transformation for João. With Jane's help, he had not only begun to take care of his health but had also become involved in projects supporting the homeless. Now, he volunteered at the shelter, using his own experience to help others facing the same struggles he had endured for so many years. As Jane and João made their way to his new apartment, he found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. He had never imagined that someone like Jane, so young and full of life, could care so much about someone like him. Over the months, she had become more than just the girl he once saved. Jane was now his friend, his ally, and in some ways, his family. When they arrived at the building, João stood still for a moment in front of the apartment door. He felt a mix of emotions, joy, fear, gratitude. It was a new beginning, but also a farewell to the man he had been for so long. Are you going to be okay, João? Jane asked, her eyes filled with concern as she noticed his hesitation. João took a deep breath and nodded. I think so, Jane. For the first time in many years, I think I'm going to be okay. Jane smiled and opened the door. The small apartment was simple but cozy. There was a comfortable bed, a small dining table, and a window that let the sunlight in. For João, it was more than he had ever imagined having again. You know, he began as he stepped into his new home, for the longest time, I believed my life had no value. When you live on the streets for so long, you start to think you're destined to disappear without leaving a trace. But now I see there's still something for me. I don't know what the future holds, but I'm ready to try. Jane, feeling a rush of emotion, walked over and hugged him. I always knew you'd get a second chance, João. And I'm so happy that you're embracing it. You deserve this life, and I'm so proud of you. João stepped back, smiling, tears welling up in his eyes. It was hard for him to believe he had come this far after everything he'd been through. But Jane, with her persistence and dedication, had helped him see that his past didn't have to define the rest of his life. And what about you, Jane? João asked, his voice still thick with emotion. What are you going to do now? Jane laughed, wiping away her tears. It was as if the weight she had carried since the day she reunited with João had finally lifted. I'm going to keep doing what I've always wanted, João. I'm going to keep helping those in need and focus on my projects at the nonprofit. And of course, I'll keep visiting to make sure you're doing okay. The two of them laughed, feeling the weight of the journey they had taken together. Jane knew that, as much as she had helped João, he had also helped her. She had learned so much from him, about resilience, about the power of a promise, and about how it's never too late to redeem oneself. A few weeks later, João's life was starting to take a stable turn. He had adjusted to his new home and his new role as a volunteer. He felt useful again, helping others who, like him, had been forgotten by society. And while he still bore the scars of his years on the streets, he now understood that those scars were part of his story, but they didn't define him. Jane, meanwhile, was becoming more and more involved in her work with the nonprofit. Her experience with João had deeply transformed her, and she was determined to continue making a difference in people's lives. Her parents, Augusto and Helena, had also changed. They continued supporting João and became involved in charitable activities, trying in some way to make up for the lost time and the mistakes of the past. One afternoon, Jane was at the shelter, organizing a food drive, when she received a message from João. He wanted to invite her over for dinner at his apartment as a way to thank her for everything she had done. Jane smiled as she read the message and realized just how much João's life had truly changed. That evening, when Jane arrived at João's apartment, she was greeted with a simple meal, prepared with care. The apartment was neat and organized, and João seemed more at peace than ever. They sat down at the table, sharing laughs and memories. You know, Jane, João said after a long pause, if someone had told me a few years ago that I'd be here, in this moment, I wouldn't have believed it. But here we are. And if I've learned anything from all of this, it's that a promise, even when it seems forgotten, can change someone's life. You gave me that chance, and I'm eternally grateful for it. Jane smiled, feeling her heart warm. You deserved this chance, João. And I'm so happy to have been part of this journey with you. They toasted to João's new life, and in that moment, Jane knew that, despite all the difficulties, the promise her parents had made so many years ago had finally been fulfilled. João was living a new life, one filled with hope and possibilities. And so, as the sun set on the horizon, Jane and João knew that the cycle had come full circle. The journey of pain and regret had turned into a story of redemption and new beginnings. The promise that had changed one life had, in truth, changed many lives, including Jane's.